Okay, great. This is going to be a very, very simple set of slides, but I hope that everyone's going to be able to take something away from it. All right then. So hello everyone again. I am Davida. I am from Nigeria. I'm very excited to be on CAP for the East India Pre-WUDC, and thank you all so much for attending the workshop. Today we're going to be learning how to deliver effective OAs, and we're going to be using guidance from the Sophia WUDC Education Manual. And this is incredibly important because, as I did mention earlier, when it comes to workshops and trainings, so many people have preference for learning how to debate better. And there is nothing intrinsically wrong with that, but it's still super important to try to focus on how to deliver effective OAs, just so that judges are well aware of what debaters expect from them. But secondly, this also helps to shape debaters' expectations of what to receive when it comes to oral adjudications. Just before we delve right into it, I quickly want to talk about the mindset that judges should have when it comes to competitions, especially on a major scale, such as PUDC, WUDC, EUDC, um, ABP, whatever the regionals is, but even for small tournaments as well. It's really important to have the mentality that delivering effective OAs is a sign of respect and appreciation of the efforts that debaters put in to making sure that their speeches are great and fantastic at tournaments. Usually, when you see adjudicators who deliver poor OAs, apart from cases where it's a matter of quality and training, it's usually a very, very dismissive attempt on their part in responding to the effort and hard work that teams have put into preparing for tournaments, especially for majors like Wilds. You see universities selecting teams several months in advance. You see them having spars at odd hours, like trying to compete with their international counterparts as well. And I think it's just appreciation for how much effort debaters put into preparing for tournaments that should motivate you as a judge to want to deliver an effective OA. Apart from the breaks, apart from the accolades, apart from building a good debate CV, it's just an amazing way to express appreciation and respect for the effort that debaters put into. Over the course of this training, we will also be looking at how debaters should respond to OA, and that's also incredibly important in terms of having a wonderful tournament experience overall. Next, and then we're taking it bit by bit, and the first thing we're going to look at is what is an oral adjudication. I'm pretty sure that everyone here is familiar with what this is. An oral adjudication is a concise explanation of the decision in the debate. There are two essential elements here. The first is that you should be aiming to provide a justification for the call. That's extremely important. You're not coming to give a public speech. You're not coming to say an opinion piece. You're coming to properly justify the decision that you have arrived at, either as a solo judge or as a joint panel. The second thing that's really crucial is that the oral adjudication must serve an educational tool for teams. And this is incredibly important because it means then that you're not coming to narrate what has happened in the debate. When debaters listen to your OA, they should be able to learn a few new things. One, perhaps how to say the debate a bit clearer, how to more effectively engage in argumentation, and of course, like just general personal feedback as well as would be required by them. So this is what an oral adjudication is. Now, what are the core principles of an oral adjudication? The very first thing is clarity, and this cannot be underemphasized. You have got to explain what mattered the most in the debate in a language that is as clear as possible. Please note that when we speak about clarity, we're not referring to the accent of the judge. We're not referring to the tongue of the speaker. What we're more focused about is the content of that oral adjudication, the content of that speech. And it's really important that you try as much as possible to clearly explain what mattered most in the debate. As I mentioned earlier, you would rarely have it that an oral adjudication is a narration of what happened in the round. That would take about the hour that debaters use to present their argument. It should be a concise summary of what mattered the most in the debate. And that's why it's important to be able to bring out the key clashes in the debate. And we'll deal with this very shortly in this presentation. Now, in order to try as much as possible to have a very, very clear oral adjudication, a few things are integral. The first is your structure. I try as much as possible when I'm talking to people about adjudication to not spell out a particular structure for them, because this works differently for everyone. Not every adjudicator will have the same style of note taking, will have the same style of writing down like core points. We'll have the same style of bringing out key issues within the debate. But it's important that regardless of your structure, you must follow a clear and logical flow. It cannot be confusing to speakers. It cannot be haphazard or unarranged. It needs to be unequivocally clear in the way that you structure your speeches. Secondly, neutrality. There can be no personal biases or attacks against speakers. You cannot come up in an oral adjudication and go, that speech was horrible. Or you use curse words, pardon me, you say that speech was shit. You can't do that in an oral adjudication that is meant to be effective. You cannot let your biases get in, whether these are racial biases, ethnic biases, personal biases, which are to a large extent curbed by a CA team registering clashes, right? But please make sure that you never abuse the unique opportunity presented to you to deliver OAs to personally attack teams. That's always a no-no. It's the easiest way to get yourself exposed to an equity issue. The third is educational value, and I mentioned this earlier in defining what an OA is. Your oral adjudication should be able to help teams understand how they can make improvements within their speech. And this is even exclusive of personal feedback. Sure, you're not allowed to go too deep into what they did wrong or what they did right in your main oral adjudication, but there should still be an educational value where teams understand what kind of improvements they should make, what kind of general feedback would be helpful in their subsequent rounds at the tournament. Next, then, is looking at the key priorities of the Sophia manual and helping you all imbibe this when it comes to your individual, when it comes to delivering your individual OAs. The first thing is to identify the debate's central questions. This is also referred to as clashes, right? You can call it central questions, you can call it clashes, whatever works for you. And there are a couple of pointers here. The first thing is to assess the comparative clash and not isolated claims, not isolated points. In a typical effective OA, you would have that divided into key clashes. There's no way you deliver an effective OA without looking at the key clashes in the round. And now, in trying to determine what the key clashes in the debate is, you cannot look at isolated claims that the speaker makes. You cannot look at one-liners, sentences here and there that come together to piece up the entirety of the debater's speech. You need to assess the comparative clash. And what the comparative clash is looking at ideas or arguments that teams spend the most time going back and forth on. Okay, so if it's the principle, let's say it's this household ban, it's a this household ban abortion debate, right? And there's a principle espoused by any team in the round, and it's that of the right to life and why then abortion becomes illegal. And then Other opposing teams spend a lot of time clashing this by explaining why the right to life is not absolute. For example, the mother's life is in danger. For example, the child is incredibly deformed and will not be able to live a meaningful and fulfilling life. For example, you cannot afford that child the necessary dignity that it deserves if the parents are in no economic condition to take care of that child. Then that automatically becomes a central question because it's a clash that teams have spent a lot of time going back and forth on. So that's how you assess a comparative clash. If there is a one-liner somewhere that is not engaged at all, that's very isolated. Maybe a speaker comes up and says, maybe a speaker comes up and says, oh, I'm trying to think of an example. Maybe they say, oh, women are sub-inferior, and it's not engaged at all. But more importantly, they don't explain and expand on what that means. That's an isolated claim that one was not well proven, but secondly, was not very engaged amongst the different teams. And that's what you should be looking at. The second thing is that you have got to explain why winning arguments outperformed losing argument. And that's why it's really important to bear in mind that your oral adjudication is not a narration of the debate. It's not an opportunity for storytelling. It's an opportunity for you to critically weigh arguments against each other, show why the winning teams outperformed losing arguments in the round. Something that I do that could serve as a useful example is I always start from the bottom up. So I will identify what the key clashes in the debate are, and then I will go on to weigh teams against each other. I will start with the team that ranked fourth, and I will weigh them against the other teams one by one. I would do the same thing with the third team. I would have already explained why the third team outperformed the fourth team, obviously, but then I'll explain why the top two teams ranked above that third team. And then I'll go to the final two teams, which are the closest in the debate, ranking first and second. And then I will individually go over why the winning team outperformed the second team. Regardless of whatever structure you choose to use, please make sure to explain why winning arguments outperform the losing ones. You do not narrate the arguments of each team. You compare and contrast and explain why one argument outranks the other. The next thing then is that you show how burdens were met or missed. When it comes to burdens, there are a plethora of them in debating, particularly in British parliamentary debating. And this is more a speaker briefing, right? But there will be burdens that are intrinsic to you as a speaker based on the role that you ought to fulfill. So as a prime minister, most definitely you have a burden to set up the debate. You have a burden to give definitions. You have a burden to give a model and make it super clear if it's a policy debate. There has to be a counterfactual if it's a regret debate. These are intrinsic burdens, but there are some other burdens that are not explicit but will arise because of the nature of argument. Such kind of burdens include burdens to deconstruct and rebut to the best of your ability arguments made by another team in order to win the debate. Another example of an implicit burden would be to prove an argument you make that, according to the average reasonable voter, would be very, very less likely to occur. You have an increased burden to prove why your argument is likely, why your impacts are likely to result. As I said, this is a speaker briefing, but it is something you should know as adjudicators. So you can clearly tell when speakers are meeting their burdens or not. If an opposition whip comes up in their speech and begins to provide new arguments, instead of highlighting what the key clashes in the debate are and properly engaging on that front, most definitely that's an opportunity to call them out and say, hey, you missed your burden as the opposition whip. You were not meant to introduce new arguments into the debate. You were meant to give a holistic summary of what transpired in the debate and go on to talk about why you believe your team deserved the win. That's a way to explain how the burdens were met or missed. I'm going to give an opportunity to people to ask questions later on, and I really hope that this is clear and easy to follow. Next thing then is structuring your OA. And the first is the opening. And I think this is a very, very dicey one because you will meet a lot of adjudicators with very different style preferences. Some adjudicators would rather leave their rankings to the very end of their oral adjudication. So they prefer what we call suspense OAs, where you basically just give your general comments at the start of your OA, then you go on to talk about the key, you go on to highlight what the key clashes are, then you go on to explain why each team plays the way they did, and then finally you state the ranking. That's not encouraged in British parliamentary debating. It's really not. You should not be wicked to debaters. You should not be wicked to teams. What we advise you to do is to state the ranking simply and clearly. An example looks like, hello everyone, here are the rankings for today's debate. In first place, we have open government. In second place, we have open opposition. In third place, we have closing government. And in fourth place, we have closing opposition. It's simple, it's clear. Quite obviously, you do not want it to be haphazard. You do not want to say, hello, in first place we had OG, in third place we had OO, in fourth place we had, in second place we had. It needs to be simple, it needs to be clear, and I greatly encourage you to always state your ranking at the very top of your OA. The next thing that's super important is framing. You need to explain what the debate came down to. This is simply highlighting what the key clashes in the debate are, highlighting what the key questions in the debate are. This is super important. It is not an effective style of delivering OA to go to the to announce the rankings and jump straight into weighing why teams ranked the way that they did. What is more advisable is highlight what the key clashes are. There are a couple of things this does for you. The first is that it gives teams a very clear idea of the way your mind worked in arriving at your decision. And that's super important. The second thing that it does is that it infuses clarity into the debate, into the oral adjudication. Speakers are more easily able to flow with where you're coming from because they have a better sense of what your priorities were in arriving at your decision. The final thing as well is that it just makes things a whole lot easier for you because now you can begin to better explain why teams rank the way that they did because they lost out on this certain clash, they won on this certain clash, etc. The third thing you want to do after framing is you go on to analyze how each team performed on key issues. So remember, we've announced what the results are, and then we framed what the debate really came down to. And finally, thirdly, you analyze how each team performed on those key issues. This is where you begin to explain why the fourth team lost, because they lost on 2 or 3 of the key clashes. You begin to explain why the winning team won, because they won on all 4 key clashes. This is super important. Oh, and by the way, as a recommendation, you should not be having more than 4 clashes. It is very possible that a lot of arguments will have been provided in the round. You may be having arguments up to you may be having like 7 arguments, 8 arguments in the round, but you don't have to make an argument. You don't have to make every single argument into a clash. And that's why I explained earlier that the way that you draw out the key clashes in the debate is by looking at what teams spend the most time arguing, what teams spend the most time making comparisons and engagements on. Engagements look like rebuttals, it looks like POIs, it looks like constructive cases as well. And finally, you need to be able to provide a brief advice and final summary. In your OA, you don't give personal feedback here. This is in the OA that you stand in front of the room and address everyone. Personal feedback will usually be for teams that request this, right? But what you have to do here is give a general advice to people. It could be as simple as saying, hey, we would appreciate if you took more POIs in the future. It demonstrates that you're showing engagement with the debate, and it definitely improves your speaker scores as well. You could say, as a general advice with the golf bench, we would have appreciated if you were more charitable in the way that you responded to the opposition bench. Those are kind of generic advice that you can give to teams. And you also want to do a final summary as well. This is where you can restate the rankings if you want, and then just quickly highlight the clashes as well. What you do with the final summary is up to you, but it's always a good idea to restate the rankings again and say a kind word. Be like, thank you so much for the debate. I wish you all the best in your future rounds. That's an example of a good final summary. You can, after you give your OA, then you can say, and once again, the rankings were OG first, OO second, CG third, CO fourth. Thank you so much for the debate. I wish you all the best in your subsequent rounds. That's a brief advice and final summary that nicely wraps up your structure. So just a couple of core points that emphasize what we've already mentioned. First is opening the oral adjudication. You've got to be confident in stating calls. And I know that this is a case in the debate community where judges enter into top rooms with the best performing speakers in the tournament and feel very, very timid and very, very nervous about delivering their calls. You do not want to do this. You want to make sure that at all points in time, you're being super, super confident with the way that you're announcing your decision. Be super confident about it. Okay? And they're not going to beat you up. And if they're rude to you, you can definitely report it to equity. But please make sure that you state your call with as much confidence as you master. This doesn't mean pride. This doesn't mean rudeness. This doesn't mean being very dismissive. For example, making callous comments about the teams that ranked much lower, but you must be confident in the way that you present your, not just the call, but the entirety of your OA. Do not let anyone intimidate you. It just gives the appearance that you're unsure about your call to begin with, and that your call must not have been great if you don't even feel confident announcing it. So please make sure that you're always announcing your calls with a lot of confidence. Next thing is there's no need for long introductions. This is more popular in other formats like WSTC, where you start with some general comments about your style, about their content, about their strategy. But when it comes to British parliamentary, you've got to go into it really quickly. I think by the rule of thumb, your OA should not exceed 10 minutes overall. So you really don't have time for very long introductions. The example is on the slide. You could just say, oh, we rank the teams first, second, third, and fourth. All right. Now we're going to framing the debate. We already talked about this earlier, but it's really important when identifying the central questions that resulted in your judgment to explain why those questions matter. And this is super important. You need to explain why you thought that those were the key issues within the debate. You could highlight that these were the clashes that teams spent the most time engaging. You could talk about why you thought that those central questions deserved to be your priority in arriving at your decision, because they were the most impactful in the round in terms of number of people affected, in terms of quality of benefits derived or generated, in terms of quantity or quality of harms caused to the stakeholders within the round. So it's important that in identifying the central questions, you briefly explain why those questions matter to you, why you think they ought to have been the key clashes within the debate. Your framing should be between 20 to 30 seconds. That's why I said you cannot be having 8 clashes in the debate. It's not effective for a 10-minute OA. Your clashes should be 4, 5 at most. What's generally recommended, it's about 3. Also, if your clashes are less than 4 or 5, that does not invalidate your OA. Just make sure that you properly listen to the debate, you properly took a lot of notes, and you're very confident that there are only about 2 or 3 key issues within the round. All right, explaining the comparative. You need to discuss teams in the order of the call. We've already talked about explaining how the winning bench outperformed the others, but you must be explicit about weighing. Okay? You must talk about the impact of the arguments made by speakers. You must talk about the mechanism and the comparative. When it comes to impact, we're looking at how their arguments affected the stakeholders within the round. And you want to make sure that your winning teams, especially the top 2 teams, are teams that have done extremely well on all these 3. These are teams that have properly impacted their arguments, properly explained how it affects society, how it affects the stakeholders in the round, whether they are women, children, minority groups, government, political parties, schools, children, parents, whoever the stakeholders in the debate are. You want to make sure that these are teams that have done the most impactful. They have shown to a very large extent how their argument would affect society. The second thing is the mechanism, and this is a fancy debate term for very, very thorough explanations. Please note that an argument without a mechanism is just an assertion, is just a claim, and you're totally free to call it out in oral adjudication. If speakers make arguments that they feel are intuitive but provide no mechanism, no logical analysis for why that argument is true. So you must be explicit about the mechanisms that teams have provided in trying to prove that their arguments are logical, in trying to prove that their arguments are true. The final thing is the comparative. It's not a debate, it's a public speech. If people are just coming up to present arguments without engaging with other teams in the round, without doing any sort of rebuttal, without doing any sort of weighing. Please do not hesitate to call out teams that do not engage with other teams in the debate. If, for example, you're adjudicating and there's a closing government that does not try to rebut the entirety of the opposition bench, it's definitely legitimate to call them out and say, hey, sure, you have like 1 or 2 unique extensions, but we do not feel that you properly engaged the up bench in the round. We didn't hear any rebuttals, we didn't hear any engagement to them, and we marked that in ranking you. So you must be explicit about weighing, and weighing is all of these 3 things. Right. So here are some generic notes about giving feedback. The first is that it must be short, it must be actionable, and it must be non-personal advice. Please notice that there is a distinction between giving feedback and justification. Your justification is what you do first by properly explaining why you gave the decision that you did, why you gave the rankings that you did. That's super important. That is non-negotiable in giving an OA. You can decide not to give personal feedback if teams don't request for it, if there's no time for it, and you want to do that later on after the tournament, or maybe during the break after a round. But you cannot negotiate properly justifying your call. So giving feedback is more exclusive to teams and speakers in terms of talking about what they did well and what they didn't do well. It's not personal. It's not saying, hey, if you'd won a suit, maybe I would have given you a higher score. Or if you would have tweaked your accent a bit to be much clearer, then maybe you would have ranked higher within the round. You're not giving that kind of personal advice. As a matter of fact, that could constitute an equity issue. What you should be doing is giving them very actionable feedback that are predicated on the choices they make. You should not be making comments like you're a very weak debater. I don't think you're intelligent enough to understand this clash and that clash, or I think it's because of your capabilities that you were not able to you were not able to explain a particular argument well, you were not able to mechanize a particular impact well, you were not able to rebut a particular argument well. That's not great. That's not effective OA. What you should be focusing on is the choices that they made in terms of their arguments. You could say, hey, in terms of strategy, I think that the choice you made in responding this certain way was not as great. It would have been better if you responded this way. You could say, hey, I think that your decision to ignore 1, 2, 3 arguments from another team was not very strategic. I think that it was important that you choose to carefully consider what the key clashes in the debate are and prioritize your rebuttals and engagements along that route. So you focus on the choices that the speakers have made in the round. You're not focusing on your personal abilities. You're not focusing on your qualifications. You do not have a right to tell someone they do not deserve to be in a room. Please do not give comments about their capabilities. And do not do this implicitly as well. Because sure, you may not do it explicitly and call people stupid, but there's a way you can speak to a person during personal feedback that they do end up feeling stupid. Please make sure that your feedback is always encouraging, uplifting. It's not flattery, but they should leave you being encouraged to perform better at their subsequent rounds. They should leave you having an accurate understanding of what they could do better, what they did well, and how they could further improve in subsequent rounds and in subsequent tournaments as well. And please make sure that you always separate the two. Justification must always come first, feedback comes later. Let's look at some common oral adjudication mistakes that people make. The first thing is being too long or unfocused. And if we're being honest, we've all been there. I have definitely been there. I've given an OA that lasted 15 minutes once, an entire prep time, guys. And that's incredibly bad because you notice that after the 10-minute mark, speakers begin losing interest in what you have to say. Let's not forget that a tournament is very, very heavy around logistics, right? And Rajat and Kar definitely need things going according to schedule. So please make sure that you're not too long, you're not too unfocused in the way that you're giving your oral adjudication. At all points in time, you're trying as much as possible to keep your OA to 10 minutes or less. Next thing, don't rehash every argument chronologically. This is one of the reasons why OAs become too long. Highlight what the key clashes in the debate are, and then highlight major contributions to that. Don't introduce new arguments into the debate. This is super important. Sure, there will be times when you will have some spec knowledge. I am a lawyer, and on legal motions, I always have an extra advantage, or even social movements, right? But that's not a reason when I'm giving OA to then begin to make legal arguments about the criminal justice system and whatnot. It's never okay to do that. Please make sure that you're not introducing new debates into the argument. You are judging the debate based on what teams actually said and not what you think that they could have said. We've already talked about this last one. You cannot sound uncertain or defensive. Please do not let anyone intimidate you. Make sure that at all points in time, you're very clear, confident, and emphatic in the way that you give your call. This does not mean that you should be rude. This does not mean that you should be dismissive. This does not mean cockiness or pride. But this just means confidence and calm in your capabilities, especially if you've been entrusted by the CAP to deliver the oral adjudication for that room. For timing and delivery, okay. No, this was a mistake, guys. Please don't use this. 3 to 4 minutes is incredibly short. You should have about 8 to 10 minutes of delivery time. Like we said, use a calm, authoritative tone and keep your signposting very, very simple. Here are some final tips that I think are incredibly helpful. Please make sure that you always prioritize clarity over detail. This cannot be overemphasized. You do not want to give a long, winding OA. You do not want to give a long, winding OA that people don't understand. You want to make sure that Instead of sounding smart, you actually explain what the round was about. You actually explain what teams did well or didn't do well. So please make sure to always prioritize clarity over detail. You shouldn't be explaining what the arguments were in the round. You should be explaining the whys. Why did you make your decision based on the arguments that people made? Why did you weigh this issue above the other issue? Why did you weigh this rebuttal against the other rebuttal or against this argument? Why did you weigh this team above the other team? Always be looking to explain the whys. Also, remember that the OA is for the debaters, not the panel. And so many judges are guilty of this. Eye contact should be with the debaters, not the panel. You shouldn't be overly flattering the panel by trying to say, oh, this is what this member of the panel thought, this is what the other member of the panel thought, this is what we felt. And you do that significantly throughout the round without making sure that you're effectively communicating why the decision was arrived at to the teams. Remember that your OA is primarily for debaters, not the panel. So I think in conclusion, what your OA would effectively look like is first a very, very good introduction that is very short and very brief. You want to make sure that you're not going on a long, winding introduction, stating your general opinions and feelings about the round. Your priority should be announcing the call. Also, as I mentioned earlier, you want to try as much as possible to deliver the rankings before you go into the justification. Please do not resort to suspense OAs. That's incredibly mean to people's children. Please make sure that you always try as much as possible to announce the rankings right at the top of the debate. The second thing we said is that the structure was also very, very vital. Your structure must be very clear. It must be very easy to follow. You start your structure after announcing the rankings by identifying what the key clashes in the debate were, and then by going on to explain why you value those clashes as well. Then you go on to weigh teams in the debate against each other, talk about why the winning teams outperformed the losing teams. And you can do this, as I gave an example earlier, team by team. You could start with the fourth team. Some people actually prefer starting with the winning team and working their way down. I prefer starting with the losing team and working my way up. Figure out what works for you. If I were to give a recommendation, I would say start from the fourth team and work your way up, because usually the clashes get heavier at the top, and you want to make sure that you talked through this in a very, very progressive manner. Then after this, we said it was really, really important to also provide general feedback that left teams feeling encouraged about it. You also want to conclude your OA by restating what the rankings were and wishing the teams the best for the round. Just before I open the floor to questions, I want to deal with ethics, and this applies both to debaters and to adjudicators. There is always a balance. In as much as we advise adjudicators to be confident and to be very, very calm in the way that they deliver their oral adjudication, you do not want to be condescending to teams. You do not want to be dismissive in the way that you give your OA. It should be clear and it should also be detailed. Same thing with debaters as well. It's never okay to walk out on a judge in the middle of their adjudication. And walking out includes virtually as well. It's never okay to leave the Zoom call or leave the breakout room in the middle of their adjudication. They gave you the courtesy of staying and taking notes and listening attentively during your speeches. It is imperative that you also respond with the same courtesy as well. Stay while you're delivering your OAs, even if you have concerns, and then you can ask them questions about this later on. Or if you have grievances, fill the feedback form. CAP would definitely take that into consideration when breaking adjudicators as well. So please make sure to be respectful and to be kind as well. Amazing. And this brings me to the end of the workshop. Thank you all so much for listening. If anyone has any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them now. Okay, if there are no questions, I'll just hand back over to. Okay, yeah. Hi, Melissa, go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much for the workshop. So I just have three questions. So question number one is when you are presenting oral adjudication, how do you express dissenting views in case there's been a split within your panel? So I've struggled in terms of being able to fully articulate where the dissent was and how to then properly explain why there is a difference between the two dissents and how the majority essentially came to the final call or final decision. So I'm wondering how you should do that within clashes. The second thing is that when we're doing comparatives within clashes, you've mentioned trying to go either in the order of winning teams or in the order of bottom up, basically. I've also seen or heard judges attempt to go like in chronological order and then slot the team into where they are within the debate. So, for example, they start with OG and then compare the opening half to explain why maybe OG wins over OO or vice versa within the specific clash, and then do that for the entirety of their like OA. I was wondering if you've engaged with that and seen if that's also been effective in terms of understanding the call, or if it also just is a different mechanism that might generate confusion for some teams. And then the last one is there's also this growing trend that I've seen of adjudicators at the very end of their oral adjudication opening the floor for questions. Is that also something that is okay to just allow teams to question your call and have a big discussion, obviously if time permits around it, or is it something that's not really necessary to do? But yeah, those are my three questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sina. So I'm gonna start with the with answering the last one. That's certainly okay, but you have to make sure that it happens um after the justification has been done, after the entirety of your OA has been delivered. You can just open the floor and say, does anyone have any questions? They could ask you questions about your decision, at which point you have the responsibility to answer that very clearly. I would also propose that you could also shift these questions to your to members of your panel if you're with a panel and you feel very confident in your ability to answer this. But that's never a bad idea. However, it could happen that you open the floor for questions and instead of asking about your decision or questioning your decision, they just want to know about how to improve personal feedback. That's also something that you can definitely then take them aside, maybe to their own individual Discord breakouts or Zoom breakouts, and then begin to engage that. If, of course, all the other teams are fine, and maybe you just have teams waiting turn by turn to receive personal feedback or ask questions, that's okay. So, summary of that is it's perfectly fine to open the floor for questions, but you must make sure that this is done within a time constraint. You don't want to open the floor for questions and you guys are having another round in there. Also, as the chair, presumably in the round, if you're going to be inviting questions, it is your job to keep this very, very orderly. If you notice that this is becoming a back and forth, and when you're trying to respond to questions, they keep interrupting you and it gets heated, just gently correct them the first time. If it continues, just make sure that you desist from it and say, oh, I can have like a feedback recorded to you. So this is something that's happened to me before, where I was delivering and then a speaker had a question. I invited people to ask questions and a speaker had a question and then they kept interrupting me. And I was like, excuse me, please do not interrupt me while I'm speaking. And they politely conceded and we continued with it. But if it gets aggressive, please make sure to just take a step back from that situation. Tell them like you would happily record personal feedback and send it to them on a separate channel, but just make sure that that's not an avenue to get very, very aggressive. I'm not going to go into your first question, which is a case of dissenting views. And that's a really brilliant question because it does happen. The first thing I'm going to tell you, though, is that your priority must be explaining the winning vote. So let's assume that it's a panel of three and there's a 2-3 split. And let's say that the split is relatively simple. So you're just disputing on who ranks first and second. What you want to do is prioritize making sure that the verdict that is 2-3 gets very, very explained, like thoroughly and clearly explained. But here's a way to do this that makes it inclusive of the minority split. And you still follow the same structure we talked about, but it might be that the reason why there is a dissenting vote is because the dissenting judge prioritized clashes a bit differently than the two of you did. So what you could do then is to say, hey, these were the rankings with the 2-3 split. You list them out, and then you go on to say these are the key clashes in the round. I and the majority voting panel thought that clash 1 and 2 were the most important clashes in the debate. The dissenting panel thought that clash 3 ought to have been the most important clash in the debate. Then you go on to evaluate why teams ranked the way they did. For third and fourth, in such instance, it would be relatively easy to explain why they rank the way they did because that's unanimous. For the first and second, where it's dissenting, then you go on to analyze how they engage the three clashes. And then you explain why, as we did mention earlier, why you and the other winning judge prioritized the two winning clashes. Explain, oh, we thought this was more impactful. We thought the mechanisms were clearer and much more persuasive. We thought that the debate affected and impacted more people, the vulnerable stakeholders within the debate, etc., etc. Whereas the dissenting judge believed this. At the end of that, you must be emphatic in stating that at the end of the day, this was the final results. These are the results that are going to be reflected in the ballot as well. So you want to try to be inclusive for sure, but don't go back and forth in a way that then confuses everybody. I don't know if this makes sense. So you want to make sure that you still follow the structure, but you highlight where the dissents came in on the key clashes within the debate. Second question. Okay, right. The different ways of answering, the different ways of structuring OAs. Honestly, I think it could be very confusing, but this depends to a very large extent on what the winning teams look like. If, for example, the winning teams, first and second, are opening government and opening opposition, third and fourth, maybe COCG, it's very easy to take it the way you suggested by saying, after you talk about after you give the rankings and you talk about the key clashes, then you say, I'm going to start with an analysis of the opening bench, or I'm going to start an analysis of the closing bench. You talk about why CG loses out to CO, and then you give a holistic overview of why the closing teams lost out to the opening. Then you move to the opening bench, which are the top two teams anyway, and talk about why the UG lost out to OO. That's very neat, very clear, very straight to the point, and we definitely encourage that. But you may not be able to use this strategy in a case where it's, say, a long diagonal. So you've got OG winning and CO second, and then you've got maybe CG or O. It's going to be very disastrous to try to explain that without going chronologically. Something you could do, though, if you don't want to follow the strict top-down, bottom-up, is to say, okay, let's discuss the short diagonal first. Then you talk about OO and CG, talk about why either team loses out to the other, and then you talk about the long diagonal, talk about why the winning team wins both the losing team in the long diagonal, and talk about why they generally outweigh every other team in the round. Does this answer your question, Zino?
Answered it perfectly. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions, please? All right, then. Once again, thank you all so very much for taking time out of your precious schedule to attend this. I'm super aware that for some of you, this is not a very convenient time zone. This is not a very convenient time in your time zone, but thank you for taking out the time to attend this nonetheless. I'm going to pass over to Rajat and Kara for any conclusions. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Davida, for joining us for this amazing workshop. We're really glad that you were able to spare some time to take this amazing workshop for us. This will be put forward for public access as well pretty soon enough. We're very pleased to have you on board, and everybody joining in for the workshop. We're very pleased to see you here and have you on board for East India Pre-WDC. Looking forward to seeing you there.
Thank you. Bye.